when did you join the fire service? And was North Vancouver your first fire service?
No, it started in '03, just north of here, a couple hours, and I've been with North Van District for since '05.
So you did your basic training in a different place than North Vancouver, or
Yeah.
is it a regional training, basic training, or is it?
No, it's generally, I mean, there's fire academies in North America. Our model is pretty much similar to the Americans. You have fire academies that teach NFPA 1001 and other things. I went and got that, but I was also given some entry level training from that department, recruit training, and then again recruit training in this department when I moved here, and it's municipally driven. Right, each department chooses how they want to train their firefighters. So.
So when you think back on your basic training, and in particularly, let's start with like nozzle training. What was your experience of nozzle training in basic training?
Nozzle specifically was, here's your nozzle. You pull it this way and the water flows, and you close it that way. Or it flows and it closes if you push it forward. You turn one way, it does this. You turn it the other. And that was honestly the absolute extent of it.
Did
yeah,
you like
it in there? That was about it.
Was it? Did you think about that when you did basic training, or was that something like, well, you just accepted what was given to you, or did you
Absolutely.
question well, this doesn't make sense, or isn't it more to this?
I started pretty young. I mean, I think I was 20, 21 when I started. I was so excited to be involved in the fire department. Like I went on the first couple calls and I was sold. I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever, and I didn't honestly at that age, a real critical mind is something I've developed. Not that a more critical mind is something I've developed as I've gotten older. At that time, I took most of what I got as best practice or best possibility, and I didn't question much for a few years. Especially with firefighting. You know, it was much of the apprenticeship program, ears open, eyes open, mouth shut. The salty guys, the older guys, will teach you what they know, and that's how knowledge is transferred primarily. So, I didn't question a whole lot for a while.
Well, I think that's pretty normal. I would say I was the same, because I would say it wasn't. I think I've always been curious. I think I've always been like the questionable type that asks questions. But my main problem was I didn't know that I had to question things. I mean, there
Mm.
wasn't a reason for me to not, especially when it comes to firefighting, there wasn't a reason for me to kind of have any second thoughts or question what we were doing. That has to that had to grow on me as I grew more experienced, and I had incidents and situations and read things and saw things that didn't make things add up. It wasn't
Yeah.
there wasn't anything for me to begin dissecting when I started.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
if I go back and think of my basic training, I can't, I have a hard time remembering most of what has been said in basic training.
Mm.
And even though it was roughly at the same time you joined the fire service, was 2002, 2003. I joined the fire service. So it's hard to be critical when you don't have a framework to question what's given to you.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, you don't have much experience in that context or other knowledge in which to compare or relate. And
No.
it takes a while. So, we go to a few fires and things maybe aren't as cool as told or don't work out quite the way it is. We expect it, and we start to question things, and we do stumble across different people, um, different opportunities to learn, and then that starts filling in, and we start asking questions, and then some people don't like us as much.
And that's the rabbit hole, the questions. So do you remember what, especially when it comes to like firefighting, ventilation maybe and nozzle techniques maybe are the two main areas. Do you know if there was a specific time or place where you kind of went down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, there's a very specific place for me, and that was a year stint I did in Australia about 10 years ago. I worked in Sydney with New South Wales Fire Brigade, and before they let me on the truck, I had to do basic kind of familiarization training. I had some years of experience, but they wanted, of course, to show me how to catch their hydrant in their trucks and do all that stuff. Part of it was a 2-day, what I saw on the schedule, CFBT course, and I heard it's fire behavior. I'm like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And fire science was always a interest of mine. It was one of the first courses I studied and continued with that. So I was really interested in that, and went in there with my notebook and was pretty keen. And I think one of John McDonough's instructors saw that. And the first day I had him, he kind of told John, hey, this Canadian guy seems really interested. I met John. We started chatting, and he opened up the doors for me to train with his next instructor development group. So not only was it the first 2 days where I was really blown away, I said, wow, this is knowledge that is incredibly important and valuable that we're missing back in North America. And then throughout that year, I got to work with instructor development program with John and others. And then also I was working on some very busy areas for structure fires. I went through years of data and I chose the worst areas, so to speak, for fires. And I spent the year riding on those trucks. So I got to see how they were doing things a little bit different than us. And so both the theory and the practice and application. So that was really where I started falling deep down this rabbit hole. And then, took me to Sweden, where I met you, and a bunch of other places since then, of course.
So what in practical, like there's been a more emphasis on, let's say, the CFBT communities on the fire science side of things, of understanding how fire behavior works and so on. But when it comes to practice, like actually what changed in behavior, what was the biggest difference you saw in behavior between what we were used to from North Vancouver compared to Australia?
I think the changes in behavior, I think, like you and I and the rest of our colleagues and friends that do this type of thing, we're constantly in somewhat of a very much of an uphill battle, right? It's not just about having the content and knowledge available to us, but also changing the hearts and minds of those that we work with for the better, getting them to believe what we believe, and hopefully causing them to perform differently in a safer, more effective way. And that doesn't change. And I think at that time, over like 10 years ago, John had gotten the program going to a good size, but he had thousands of firefighters to deal with, to train, thousands. And not like me, where I've got, our neighboring department, I've got a few hundred or something. Not nearly as many, a couple hundred, a few hundred, not as nearly as many. So the transition, I think the momentum there, it was still a very steep curve for John. So, as I went to one station that had the training, another department or station nearby hadn't had as much. So he was still trying to get all of his guys for the first round, get them back for the second. So the changes in fireground ops and behaviors was still in kind of its early stages. It's like here, like anywhere. We have our early adopters, we have our late adopters, we have our laggards. We have everything in between, and I saw the same thing there. Some guys were super into it. Some guys said no way, and everything in between. Same thing I saw here when we started.
Would you say that would you describe as those who haven't received the training or those who didn't accept it, or would you say that there were more similarities between those and what you were used to compared to the ones that were recently trained or drank the Kool-Aid or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, I mean, what I saw there, I learned a lot, not just about fire dynamics and fire behavior. I'm going to use that kind of interchangeably. But I learned a lot about course creation, implementation, rollout. I started to see human behavior. Like John has a huge interest in the kind of the psychological side of firefighter performance, which is really important. I think if we're only focused on the content and we're trying to create change, we might set ourselves up for some big issues. So I was started to get a glimpse of how important it is to consider the human factor. The fact that there's so many pieces of it, but how we are very biased. We don't like change, and certain practices that will work against us and work for us when we're trying to implement these new ideas. And that led me to read other material that, Everett Rogers, sociologist, diffusion of innovation, and many other concepts that I've learned to add in there with the actual core content to help us be successful. I've really tried to consider the human side of the things. And what I saw there in Australia was no different than everything I see here and everywhere else. We're all just human beings, and we all have a lot of these intrinsic characteristics that work for and against us, for sure.
Well, it's the age-old long problem. You can't make anyone change. You can only convince them to change themselves.
Mm-hmm. They have to believe what we believe.
Yeah.
Or they won't do it. Unless there's a strong enough repercussions for not some sort of policy and procedures. But to get them to really apply and change, they have to want it.
Yeah, you can't enforce. Well, you can somewhat enforce behavior, but it's ridiculously hard, and the penalty for doing so is unbelievably high on so many levels. So the only practical outcome is that you have to make them believe what you believe, and do the changes afterwards. But that's hard, as you know, and especially when you have budgets and so on, in time restraints. But so you encountered that in Sydney, and when you got back home, so what was your? Did you have a goal? I'm getting it. Are you there?
I'm here. Is the screen frozen though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, you go back in. So when you got back from Sydney, what was did you have like a first goal, or did you have like a particular list of things that these are the things I need to change like ASAP?
Yeah, I was pretty naive, and 10 years ago or so, when I got back here, I had less seniority. I didn't know our guys as well. I hadn't earned some degree of respect that we all hope to do through good performance throughout our careers. And I was pretty young and pretty new to be coming back here with a lot of bushy-eyed ideas. And I honestly took a licking for a while. Actually, I was sitting right at this desk in the training division when one of the most senior captains came in and was yelling at me that I was going to destroy the fire department because I was trying to do what we're doing, adjust some of our practices to be better with water and better with air and ventilate in maybe an adjusted way, and a bunch of other things. And he was not having it, right? And he was the extreme example, but I had a lot of resistance, and I went into it fairly naive at that point, and I really got my butt kicked and had to step back and reframe my approach. And it took a year or so from that point to get some reasonable momentum, and it just started building on itself kind of naturally. But the first couple of years were difficult. And then once the guys saw the value in this education and they started applying some pieces on the fire ground and seeing that it really does help if you close the door while you're charging your line and some things like that. Like, wow, they were really keen to learn more. And the support I have for my fellow instructors and I have in the department is huge. I mean, I don't think we have any detractors at all. 100% buy-in, and that's from years of trying to deliver good quality training, but also from seeing good outcomes on the fire ground from adapting towards more of an evidence-based approach. So
that leads me to different questions. So we talk about naivety, and I have the same experience as you have. It's fun to come home and think that, well, if I tell them this, my worldview, they will just accept it. They will come to me with open arms and say, Lars, thank you for this new knowledge. It's about no. So it is a process, but when I think about it, is when you start building, like what you say, momentum, in the sense that they're starting to see that some of the things work. It doesn't have to be a particular thing. Some of the things work. You also develop, I don't want to use the word fear, but you become very cautious that, well, hey, people are actually listening at me. I mean, there's people actually listening at me, and it's pretty critical that what we do get right. I mean, for both safety and what we're trying to achieve. So, did you have any? Did you have any like second thoughts about am what I'm doing right? Am I, like, because when you're kind of the lonely one going against the rest, you're either crazy or you are the one who has a new idea that works. And it's sometimes probably hard to understand which one it is.
Yeah, I don't think I ever felt that. Sorry about the radio. That's going to happen from time to time.
Yeah.
I'll try to mute it when it does so you don't hear it. I never felt like the general initiative was wrong. I definitely felt, up against the ropes and frustrated and everything in between from time to time. But the general direction of this type of education, I've never had any doubts with. I think it's incredibly important, and I'm happy to be a part of that. Now, do I second guess pieces of it, or delivery, some of the content, some of the, I wouldn't say, yeah, there's definitely things that I've second guessed from time to time, and we've made changes, we've made errors, and I'm constantly looking for what we can do better, what we can improve upon. But what am I doing that I shouldn't be? What am I not doing that I should be? Errors within our system, errors within trying to be as open as I can to my errors in judgment, lack of knowledge, my assumptions, my biases. I'm constantly trying to challenge myself and not believe everything I think right away. And just,
it's very hard not to believe what you think.
It's very difficult, but
it's a big
there's
one.
certain aspects of it that have literally kept me up at night for a few hours here and there, worrying about the outcome of a certain piece of the education, the delivery of it. Is it great? Are guys going to read into it inappropriate messages, perform unsafely, or whatever? But yeah, I'm constantly trying to ask those questions.
So, because one of the biggest pieces, I would say, that one of the biggest battles between, if there are two big battles between a European side no, I wouldn't say rest of the world side, because that's not true, but a European, and in this case Australian side, and the North American side, is basically ventilation and nozzle practices, like doing gas cooling, for instance. Those are the major pieces, I would say, where there are major differences. So you came home with the European sense of, oh, sorry, there's a printer going on. The wife printing something back upstairs. She has an office up there, and I have an office down here. Just gonna wait for it. Yeah. So one of the things you came out when you left to Australia, did you do gas cooling with straight streams? I mean, did you do gas cooling at all? Were you at the level of you were not cooling smoke at all?
No, you're just pretty much holding your water till you found the orange
glow.
That was
yeah. So you had two pieces. You had both that you needed to gas cool in some way, and you were taught that you needed to do a fog when you were in Sydney. So when you got back and started implementing those and getting people to gas cool and then switching to fog gas cooling, how was that process in terms of how hard was that to make that switch?
It wasn't easy, in the sense there's a bunch of different components to it. There's the education piece, there's the equipment piece. Our nozzles we had were quite poor. They were everything from, something bought on the mid 80s to, we had a couple old, like, just really decent new Acron nozzles to really old Acrons. We had huge inconsistency across our equipment. And for that technique to be done well, first of all, from the equipment standpoint, I'm a believer that as a firefighter moves from truck to truck and line to line, he needs to have a good sense and knowledge and a good feeling and connection with that piece of equipment, because he's operating under stress in a dark environment, with gloves on, limited dexterity, and all those things. So one of the changes we made was to get rid of all of our attack line nozzles, and we went with a specific manufacturer. We had certain components put together, selectable gallonage. We had a detent between the straight stream and the wide fog, so the guys could easily, in a dark environment, feel the click of a 30 degree. That would help them find the pattern that they felt was necessary for that environment. They were able to change gallonage depending on what they found. Had a piston valve, it was very easy to operate. It created reasonably good water droplets, good distribution, and all those things that were important. So we tried to simplify the equipment side of it and get consistency. And with the education side, we started with why, right? Why is it important to cool smoke? Why does this work? What's the physical process of transferring your water from a liquid into a gas, and the energy transfer and all that's happening? What are we doing to the gases? And once they bought into that, I mean, before they weren't cooling smoke, and they thought, hey, that seems reasonable. We sold it to them, and they put in some really solid effort into developing that skill set, and we worked on it for years, and many years. And I was constantly evaluating how we were doing, and we spent a lot of time on it.
Because I mean, that's been for me growing up in the Swedish Fire Service. That's been the norm forever. So that there hasn't been any switch. That switch happened 30 or 40 years ago, or at least started happening 30 or 40 years ago, and so now nobody has any notion of anything else, and that goes both in terms of needing to address the smoke, but also in the how of doing it with a fog. So that's been the only way to go, and it's gone to overboard that we've forgot about the straight stream in Sweden, which is my new pet piece, or one of the new pet pieces I have to fix again. But at some point you realized or came to the conclusion that this is not basically worth the time needed to develop that skill set, or is that a right assessment?
Well, I'll tell you this. I'll jump right to the far end of this, just so you can see where anybody listening can see where this is going. We stopped doing that. We're flowing 150 gallons per minute on a straight stream from entry to the door to the seat of the fire. So we've changed to let's call it the American method. After years of that technique, what took us there were both training challenges, operational observations, both firsthand. How are our guys performing on the training ground here during non-live fire, during live fire scenarios? What are we seeing? How are they performing on the fire ground when I'm on the line with them? When I'd go to fires or go to post-incident action reviews and listen to what our guys are doing, and talk to the nozzle operators about how their performance was. And it's hard to get data that way, but we had some close calls. One specifically, a young officer with his crew backed out of a fire, backed out of a living room because he couldn't get a handle of it, and it flashed over right after they came out. And he came up to us and he was very grateful for the education we had provided him, because he felt like the indicators of impending flashover were present. He recognized that, and he got his guys out, and it flashed over. So in one sense, that was a success. And then I started prying a little bit deeper. I really looked at the structure. I looked at the ventilation profile, the fuel load. I tried to get an estimate of the heat release rate, what kind of amount of flow rate would be required to control that. And I started talking to them about what they were doing with their nozzle, and they were doing. Sorry, 1 second here.
Greenway Health, Bill 17 response here on shore. Again, district is Greenway called seizures. 5793, Nancy Greenway, Upper Street, Nancy Greenway Health, Bill 17 going on here on shore.
Now, as they described, they were doing what we had trained them in the way in which we had trained them, but who knows? But the point is that with their line, they weren't able to control that fire, and they had to back out before it flashed over. And I looked at that and many other instances of observation and information, and I really started to worry that this is a challenging technique for firefighters when they're under stress in an unknown environment with limited or zero visibility. the human factor that comes into play here is very, very important. For me, I really believe the technique works. It's probably, for a firefighter with a nozzle, it's the most efficient way to cool gases. But I started to question whether it's the most effective way when you start to look at the human factor combined with other things. I wasn't so sure. And we started playing with the straight stream in our training buildings and others. We use thermocouples when we burn. We're monitoring things, and it's limited instrumentation, but it is some information and data. And we started to see that it's as effective, if not more effective in some cases, than the fog method. The straight stream bounced off the ceiling. And that started to raise some eyebrows and raise some more questions. And then I started to see the data that was coming out of UL's interior study, even before it was out. Some of it, because we were on this discussion. So prior to that, it gave us kind of a leg forward to making this decision. I got to see an indicator that this was, in fact, effective. Is it as efficient? No way. Way more water hits the floor. Way more water is wasted, per unit flowed. But I care about effectiveness for our firefighters first and foremost, making sure they're safe from the door to the seat of the fire. And it is extremely easy to do, relatively, for a firefighter under stress in those environments, as I discussed. And we made the change probably, a year and a half ago. We got rid of those nozzles because they were problematic for some other reasons. And we went with solid gallonage 150 fog nozzles, constant gallonage 150. And that's where we're at.
So because there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, you sure? Especially for the people that are going to watch this.
Yeah.
This is a big sub. It's interesting how gas cooling seems to define a lot of the European and Australian, the CFBT models.
Oh, yeah, but it's the practical outcome of the entire thing that you taught about. It all builds up to like the concept of cooling gases.
But it kind of does the programs that our friends have put so much time and effort into creating. It kind of does them a disservice because it's sometimes viewed from the outside as a gas cooling course.
I know,
surrounded with some fire behavior discussion. It's the exact opposite.
But it is the opposite. But behavior is so important. Like that's what most people see. Everything's like, okay, so it might be seen as this, all the whys we talk about, which is solid and valid and necessary nonetheless, is used to justify the how. So it becomes like a justification for, in this case, gas cooling. But if you were to switch out the fog gas cooling to straight stream gas cooling with the exact same course, you would have justified how in straight stream gas cooling. So it is a problem. But it's been synonymous with gas cooling, has been synonymous with fog, because I mean, from my perspective, if the Swedish Fire Service, when talking to, for instance, Mats Rosander and reading all books and other instructors, I mean, we came from solid streams. We came from smooth bores in the 60s and 70s in Sweden. But it was low flow smooth bore. It was basic. It could be all the way down. Like the normal was to go in with about, I don't know, it's like 35 gallons per minute. That was it. And then you can manually, there was a stack tip, so you can manually take away and break it up. And that's what we came from, and that's what Giesecke and Rosander said, well, this is not working. But I think the major piece of that was because they weren't using it in the same way, and they didn't have the same flow rates. So you have a lower flow rates, and tactically it was indirect attack. So basically the Swedish method back in the 60s and 70s was find a hot surface. Doesn't necessarily have to be the fire. Just find a hot surface, just whip it around to create steam and get the steam blanket, get the steam smothering effect of the indirect attack. And that's why you see firefighters back in the 60s, 70s, they were laying flat on the ground. They were crawling on the ground into the fire because they were pushed down by all that steam. So when Matt Rosendo said, well, this is not working, he wasn't trying to break the stream up to droplets to do gas cooling that way. They were trying to do it indirect attack. And from then, and I don't know where this comes from, but it's been throughout the late 20 years, 30 years, it's been said that if you whip a straight stream up the ceiling, the droplets that it creates are just too large to be effective. Not talking about inefficient, just it's not even effective. And that's been the truth. And nobody has ever done any science on it. Nobody has ever done any trials on it. It's not been on the radar. So, and that was the truth that was given to people around the world, where Sweden started to do gas cooling. People took the method as with a fog as synonymous with the need to gas cool. There wasn't anyone else doing gas cooling with straight streams. There wasn't a competition. Nobody was doing gas cooling besides with a fog. So it wasn't until basically the North American Fire Service started, well, we need to cool gas, but how are we going to do it? Well, you just do it with straight stream, trial and error, and it worked. So, I mean, so back just 15 years ago, who knew? I mean, a lot of fire departments were constantly flowing back then also, but they just didn't call it gas cooling and didn't know. Usually they didn't know what they were like, what the reason for it working and why were you flowing and so on. They just knew it worked from experience. So I think that there wasn't a reason, and second piece also, there wasn't any reason to question it. Like if you go back to Sweden in the 70s, I mean, what was the biggest volume you could get into, like in a normal apartment? Like it was tiny. So there wasn't any reason to question it, because effectively, I mean, you are with a low flow, high pressure nozzle doing fog gas cooling, you are overpowering any fire in small volumes. When does it become a problem? Usually when the volume increases. When you're getting like seaside window openings with massive fails. Like there wasn't a reason to question gas cooling when we didn't have those problems. Then it became a problem. When firefighters are going into commercial buildings or public buildings, doing gas cooling with a fog, even if you do long pulses that get you water 5 meters or 10 feet, 15 feet ahead of you. And then anything beyond that point is definitely not just inefficient but ineffective, which is, like we said, is the most important to be effective. Then second choice is to be efficient. So I don't think there has been a reason to question it. But when it reached America, which does have a context difference, because the flow was already much higher, which means that even if it was inefficient, which in comparison to fog in small volumes, it is. It had volume, and the second one, the volumes are bigger in general, which means that you are becoming ineffective and inefficient. Secondly, when you're getting longer distances. So there was a context difference.
Yeah, for sure.
So and to me that was the I think that's been the most humbling or annoying, depending on how you look at it, experience of going to America a lot. That was the challenge of meeting people saying, well, we do gas cooling, we had straight streams and it works. I go like, well, bullshit. You don't understand what you're talking about. Let me explain to you. And going with this overconfident, because that was I was told. That was what I believed. That was my experience that it worked and so on. And then we can also talk about like, for instance, vertical ventilation, which also has advantages and so on. I don't really like vertical ventilation anyway, but there are things that are to a big advantage that are not being talked about. And I hate when you discuss a problem and because you believe I'm throwing stones in glass houses here, but if you believe in, I think we should go that route. And to convince people to go that route, you give them only the benefits of going that route, but don't the drawbacks. You don't give them the benefits of staying as they were before, because people are going to call bullshit on that extremely fast. Because if you're not telling this, what else are you not telling me, and so on. And you don't convince people that you understand the situation, you understand the problem, you understand both viewpoints. And that was for me all the time. When I was taught why vertical ventilation is bad, for instance, it was always about the negatives, like the danger of being on the roof, the blah blah blah, and then it was never taught about the good sides, and that's extremely frustrating. So when I went to America, that was the first thing. Well, not the first thing. That was the most humbling thing about. Damn it, there are more ways to skin a cat. I mean, there are disadvantages too. But I go. So but let's see if we can find. I want to get back to some of the things about straight stream gas cooling. But I want to ask you this first. Is there any problem with the theory of gas cooling as you see it? Like what
depends what you mean. What you mean by gas cooling means by.
You can unpack that question in a way you like.
Look, I think this quote pops into my head with this question, and it really resonated with me when I started looking at this problem. And the quote is from someone you'll know. And he said, he goes, "In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not." So I'll say that again. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And that was by Albert Einstein. And that really resonated with me because the theory of gas cooling, as it's done, the calculations, the theoretical idea of it makes sense to me. It totally does. And my observations of it in an environment with known variables and a very proficient practitioner, it works fairly well. When you add the complexity of our working environment, complexity of human performance under stress, I think it starts to break down. And there's challenges within that aren't fully, by some, including myself in the past, may not be fully recognized yet and understood. And so in theory, yeah, it works. In practice, I think it's more complicated.
And that's the thing. I mean, I think it's if you rant a little bit, it's pretty easy to spot the flaws. Like if you take practicing gas cooling, you have small volumes, known sizes, you know exactly what you're supposed to do. There's no other things to think about. You can usually see your nozzle. It's not that bad environment because you want to have some visibility. There's a small fire. And then you go in and you control the environment, which is not flammable either. It's just smoke, visible smoke. There's rarely any potential for fire in it. And then you move to an environment where that is not your main objective, to cool gases. You have a sort of unknown nozzle. You were not anticipating a fire that day. You're standing out in the courtside trying the nozzle out for 5 minutes before you move in. You don't know the volume of the space you're in. You don't know how hot it is. You can't even see above your head how hot it is. And then you start throwing in all those variables. Like is that going to affect performance? We go like, well, most people go like, yeah. Go like, so would that take away the effect of being efficient? Meaning if we can't know those things, we can't be efficient anyway, because the only way we can do that is just overcool. So we're still going to overcool to be effective and so on. Yeah. So we're still going to.
I'll add to this though, when we're talking the theory of gas cooling and we're comparing, a European, for lack of a better term, technique and an American, it wasn't just about the cooling impact when we looked at our options, but part of it was too that in order to gas cool as per European objectives and proper technique, we had to be on low flow, 30 GPM. And as you know, in North America, we have different building practices. We have large spaces, we have large windows, open floor plans, a lot of opportunity for high heat release rate fires. And our guys that went in on that fire that I mentioned before were on 30 GPM and they got pushed back. And why didn't they just click over a couple to 150? I don't know, but they didn't. And that's part of the truth of the environment and our challenges, right? That's part of the truth. So I was worried about that the fact that they were going in for a fire. In most cases, that's going to work.
But that's a problem, right?
It is. When you need 150 GPM, it's a serious day. Yeah. And I want them to be able to have that as a safety margin built into their system. I don't want them on the edge of safety. I want to have some sort of safety system or margin there. So now they have 150. Do they need it all the time? No. But they have it if they need it. And otherwise, we discussed, minimizing water damage, minimal application for the fire, matching, those kind of things. But it wasn't just the gas cooling aspect. It was also the extinguishment piece as well. And when they're on selectable gallonage on low flow, what that means when that larger window fails, when the wind direction shifts or some other unexpected happens and they need high flow, do they have it? Can they achieve it quickly through automatic kind of response, physical response? And the question was just unknown. And I highly suspected that an unreasonably large portion of our firefighter population wasn't going to be able to perform that in those conditions optimally. So
that would be the answer to Sweden too. And that is the tragical answer. And I often hear the defense that you should know your nozzle as your rifle and you should train every day and all the things. But the reality is that people don't want to do it and people don't have the time to do it.
For us, the context is also more important. Our department is on the edge of the metropolitan Vancouver area where it meets the mountains. We have canyons, rivers, cliffs, trails, and we are kind of the entry into the outdoor recreation area. I think from last data we've kind of looked at is we do more technical rescue than any other department in North America per capita. When it's not raining like this, we're out doing everything from trail extrications to rappelling into canyons, water rescues, high angle rescues, low angle, everything in between, sometimes multiple times a day, right? So that's a huge part of our portfolio. It requires incredible training to be able to operate in swift water conditions and high rapid rivers to on cliffs and so forth. And we also do everything else you can imagine. So the demands on our training division are immense. The demands on our firefighters to be able to perform this huge array of disciplines to a very high level of competency is vast. And we had to look at that honestly and look at, how much more time can we allocate to this nozzle thing? And is it even going to achieve us the outcome we want anyways? Or is it more realistic that we have to look at something else? And we felt that we validated that other option sufficiently before we made that change.
Was building right off, meaning building gets torn down anyway, was that part of your evaluation process? Meaning that, what difference does it make if we use, a couple of 100 liters of water less, but the building is still going to be torn down?
Yeah, that whole argument. I don't care if there's tons of water damage. Yeah. It's going to be torn down. I don't subscribe to that personally. I have a strong personal concern with excess water damage. It actually really drives me crazy when there's excessive water damage. There's always going to be some water that's still in liquid form on the ground, and it's just the nature of it. But when we have it excessively running down a hallway, running down a staircase, feeding through the floor into another uninvolved suite in a multi-residential, those things really bother me because it displaces people. It has economic and social impacts, things like that. I don't believe that it's okay just to flow indiscriminately. We're like some subscribers just flow and go, and just if it doesn't need it, it's going to get knocked down anyways. That's a bit far from me. personally. But that said, when fires occur in buildings here, the renovation process is extensive. They do really go overboard. They pull out everything. There's, not to get into this too much, but there's a lot of money to be made by companies that do this, from insurance companies, and they go extremely far in creating work for themselves in fire situations. So,
well, I mean, yeah,
I've seen it myself. We had a small fire in my home a couple years ago, very small. It had to do with the tenant and stuff, but the company that came in and the work that they did to restore that space was excessively over what was reasonable. But that's the nature of this environment right now. It's not right, but it is the nature, and that doesn't qualify anything, but it is the nature of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. It's a little bit out of your reach, but I mean, I know from my context in Sweden and Norway now, single-family houses are being torn down to a much more higher degree than they were before, and that is simply because if there's smoke in the wood framing, and you don't discover it and you don't get rid of it, and then you put on all the surfaces, and then a hot summer day you start smelling smoke in your house, and they get to do it all over again. Insurance companies don't want to have that hassle, so they just tear it down and rebuild it. So that is a part of what's changing, and it's not part of in Sweden. It's not even remotely part of the evaluation process yet, but it has to be, because if we're looking at risk, health and safety and so on. I mean, and you take into account that 30 years ago, furniture was like one of a kind a lot of times, and there was pictures on the wall, there was art on the wall that was one of a kind. I mean, going to people's houses today, going to my house, how many items do I have in my house which are not possible to purchase somewhere?
Mm-hmm.
It's part of what's changing is that we live in more replaceable homes than we did 30 years ago.
Sure. Disposable homes, disposable clothing, disposable furniture.
Yeah.
Everything has a...
And that has to be part of the decision process when you go inside and saying, oh, well, are we going... I'm not saying that using fog is necessarily dangerous. Do not take that away. But it has to be part of the decision process of being, okay, well, to what extent is it worth allocating training for a technique that is supposed to give less water damages, if water damages is a non-issue sometimes? Because in multifamily houses it is not. That is a big concern, because if you use too much water, you damage houses further down in the structure, and that is so but for single family houses, that's definitely one of the things that has to be looked at. But I want to, and that said, we know that if you do a fast fire attack, that's not a lot of water. Even if you have a fully open bale and 150 GPM, that is not a lot of water if you move in pretty fast. So I don't think it's an issue in that sense either. I mean, most of the water damage either comes from not recognizing you're not effective, which means you're spraying water into a window or down a hallway into a room and nothing happens. I mean, if you're putting water into a room, it's almost like it doesn't really matter what tool or what technique you use. If you get 10 seconds of water into that room and you're not being effective, you have to change. It's not, it doesn't, you can't, and the reason, and the answer is rarely get a bigger line. It's, change your angle, change your whatever you have to do. There's something wrong. So I think what?
A flow problem. It's a placement problem.
It's a distribution problem. You're not getting water where it needs to go. It's not a flow problem in that sense. And the other part is just post knockdown. Is overhaul. That's where you create a lot of water damages. It's not from the actual fire attack if the fire attack is done properly, where you get water damages. But now I only say it like this because I look into my head right now. Let's look at my Swedish context, and I say, well, sure, fog has limitations. So the most obvious one for me is saying that, well, anything basically above somewhere around 5 or 10 meters in distance, but short one, say 5 meters, so 15 feet. Like anything above that, the firefighter should contemplate of switching to a gas cooling with a straight stream. I would say that, because above that, that's a fairly easy one, because above that distance you're not being affected with the fog. I mean, you can't get droplets to travel that much further into an oncoming conveyor belt of energy. I mean, if you're standing in a room without any airflow, you can throw droplets further than that, but you're not being affected when you have a flow coming at you. So I think that's, for me, an interesting one. And to start up with that one, I think what is interesting to see about, I mean, it's not talked about that much, even though it becomes the conclusion. When you do a straight stream on a fixed position, you don't move it that much. I don't know. There's probably some scientific word for this, but I know it. But you get the effect that it hits the surface, and it tends to ride the surfaces because of the
momentum and the
momentum. Yeah, but the
tension and
the stickiness of water. What's the English word? The surface tension. Yeah, surface tension. Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. But anyway, you rise the walls and it flows down. So you don't get a ton of droplets. You get some droplets. But when you start to move it around and there's actually a new splash of water hitting the surface all the time, that first splash of water creates a ton of droplets. I mean, I haven't done high-speed footage on it. I have to do that sometime. But it's very obviously see that it's a massive difference. And to me, that's the only difference. Like if you want to do, if you're cooling, if you want to do surface cooling, put it in the ceiling, let it ride the ceiling and onto the walls. But if you want to do gas cooling, you're much more effective at whipping around, because again, you're creating much more droplets.
So can I add to this, or
yeah?
kind of? And when I think people, many people, our friends and others, have considered these two techniques, it's often looking at the water droplet that is going to do the cooling from a fog versus the water droplets that will be created bouncing off the static surface that will cool water, right? And they're going to be larger. There are going to be less of them off the straight stream.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
But something that's maybe not often considered sufficiently, and I don't have the answer for it, but I'm interested in, is what impact does it have when we're sweeping that upper ceiling and we're cooling it, and it's now has to be reheated by absorbing some of the energy of the gases in the environment. And then subsequently, we still have that factor of both the steam that's created from the droplets or off the linings. That steam's going to be heated up to equalize with the gases in that vicinity or an elevation as well. So I think there's multiple energy transfers or methods taking place with the solid bore, that specifically the impact of the surface cooling and the reheating of that. I think it's a more important piece than we've thought about in the past to understand the theory of that technique.
Well, I think it's more important that we contribute to it, but I'm not in. I mean, I've talked to Steve about it and Robin and so on, and much in it, but I don't agree with it. I mean, if you take, so in the perfect sense, if you direct the stream to the ceiling, it rides the surface. Let's say in the perfect world, there's no droplets created at all, like magic.
Mm-hmm.
That would be as to having cold sides of the container, for instance, cold metal sides, like something highly conductive that sucks the energy away from the smoke. All the radiation coming from the smoke or the fire, the flames are hitting the surface and being absorbed by the surface, and if you we had this discussion before, if you cool the outside of the container, it's very hard to get a flashover inside. Like it takes away the energy from the container. Like if you have snow on your side container, it's like it's a pain in the ass to get a good fire in that container until you melt that snow and get rid of the water, because again it sucks the energy out from the gases. So that would be like the indirect gas cooling by cooling the linings, like that would be.
Sure.
And And that is how calves works in most of the case. If you know like again, if you take away the calf splashes and it rains down also, but the majority of the work from calves is done by treating the walls, which absorbs the energy from the gases, and it's very very effective. There's no discussion about it. I mean, it's hard to discuss, hard to deny when you do the transition attack experiments. You do a straight stream to the ceiling. You basically coat the walls, and you see that room goes from flashover down to a incipient fire most of the case. So is it effective? No doubt about it. Now, what would be interesting is see how big of a what would the ratio have to be through the volume to the surfaces for it to be effective. Like if you scale it up to a bigger box, so the ratio of wall to surface compared to the volume of the gases becomes smaller. Now, is it still going to be effective? At some point, it will not be effective. Like if you go to a really big box, it will not be effective because of the sheer distance between the hot gases and the surface. Like so I think there's a limitation to that technique, even though like in normal residential, it doesn't really matter how you spray water into a room, you will knock it down anyway. It's like it's such a small problem usually in like a bedroom. Now you go into a big great room with open floor plan, now it starts to become a difference. But I would say, because if you, I've done some small, this is really not science. You people shouldn't take it like that. But if you do the liquid LPG container, rolling flames above your head. Now, if you go in there and you do a fog, and let's say in that container with that flow of LPG coming at you, let's say 115 liters per minute, 40 GPM. That is enough to suppress the flames so that the flames never pass you. You move it back and forth and you suppress the flames. Now, if you do a straight stream and you hold it steady, so you only coat the ceiling of that container and coat the walls, you can flow 400 liters per minute. You're gonna have flames shooting out. There's no way you can protect yourself with only having a static stream. But as soon as you start to whip that stream around, you're roughly around 250 liters per minute. You are effective. But if you go down to 115 again, you're gonna have flames shooting over your head when you whip that around.
Yeah.
I mean that's just. That is not scientific, but it's fairly good.
Yeah, but all tools have their limitations.
Oh, absolutely.
We all know that, and it's like.
But I think it's important that I think it's just yes, it is. Well, I mean, and it's. I mean, I'm a firm believer of it. Doesn't really matter what tools you have in your fire truck. If you can use them properly, you're going to be successful. I mean, so that's the bottom line. But it's still an interesting discussion to say what's the most effective tool and so on. But I want to have that. My opinion is still that it's important to create droplets. I mean, the importance.
I think it's important to put water in the right place.
Yeah, but that's a very.
And understand what you're trying to do and what's going on, where that energy's, how it's being created, where it's coming from, where it's going, where you are within that, and what resources you have in your hand to control that flow and energy, and making whatever you have work the best you can. There's no panacea in the whole. It's funny, gas cooling is such a hot topic, and I'm glad we're talking about this because it's interesting, but it's such a small part of overall safety, effective operation.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's like if you don't have good crew continuity and communications and line management skills and can't get that nozzle from the door to the sea of the fire, you're not going to be successful. If you don't have, you know what I mean? There's so many pieces.
Oh yeah.
In gas.
Oh, absolutely.
Small portion of that. It's important, but it seems to get, I don't know, a lot of
disproportionate amount of energy,
high amount of focus.
Yeah.
And
I agree, fully agree.
You know, for some reason it hits a tone with a lot of people, but I don't know why that is.
I mean, but that's the why we're having this discussion, because I mean, if I believe that nozzle technique was important, I would have stayed with fog much harder, because I do deem it to be in a very skilled nozzle operator knows what she's doing. fog will be the most efficient tool to be effective with in most of what we fight fires in. And then they switch to straight stream where that is needed because of distance. But when I take into account that, okay, how good generally are firefighters? How much training do we want to spend on it? How important is that? Is it to be efficient compared to just being effective? Then it becomes an interesting topic, and it will be it might be easier than I thought to make the switch and saying that, well, we need straight stream definitely for sure. But I don't think that we will by the next 10 years go to straight stream, just because I would say that it's not that hard to be efficient and effective in small volumes with the fog. It becomes a challenge when you go up to great room sizes, like, big living rooms and those. Then it's where it becomes a challenge and it becomes hard to be efficient and effective. So I don't think we need to get rid of it altogether, but to make that switch to recognizing that I'm not going to be efficient here, I'm not going to be effective here, and making the switch to a straight stream for just purely for distance. I think that's a reality that I need to take into account to be able to lessen the need for training. But it is interesting saying that, well, we want to skip it altogether. We want to go to straight stream altogether because we want to focus on ventilation, tactics, communication, like you said, because that's much more important pieces than nozzle technique.
And that's been a huge part of us. It's like, this is such a small component of what we do. It's much more of a holistic approach to total effectiveness and safety on the fire ground. There's so many pieces, everything from the command system down to the smaller details of personal equipment to we've really stepped up our thermal imager performance, the technology we're using now, the way we're using it, how we understand it, how we communicate that with the team or your team members inside and move together and benchmark and interior observations and assessments. And there's so many other pieces, so much to it that gas cooling's a really small portion, but it's important. And making the best decision we can for our context, our challenges in our environment, our training environment, and our out in the real world based on our buildings. It's important for sure to do our best.
What do you think is that? Because there is a problem here when we talk about gas cooling. There is this constant mix-up. Are we talking about the effect or the technique? And technique, we're talking about fog. So I mean, you're doing gas cooling if you do a straight stream. You're doing gas cooling if you do it with a fog. If you're actually cooling the gases or cooling the smoke. I never use the word gas cooling anymore. First off, it's not gases, and it bothers me that we call it gases even though it's gas. So it's smoke. But I never say smoke cooling. I just say cooling smoke. Like I switch the wording because I want to talk about the effect. And then later on, when we start talking about techniques, we talk about cooling smoke with fog nails, you're cooling smoke with dry chem, you're cooling smoke with straight streams, you're cooling smoke with different flows, different angles. Because I put something I've changed massively in my head the last 2 years is mixing. That's for me, like, it's been like actually understanding mixing has been the biggest revelation for me, or trying to explain the mixing the last couple of years. So that becomes a much bigger piece before we even get to techniques, like understanding. Like it's super interesting. If you take hydraulic ventilation, I mean, Sweden has been doing hydraulic ventilation with a fog for, as long as there's been fog nozzles, which is safe for most fire departments. And we knew that the fog moved a ton of air. Did people recognize it? That we're moving a ton of air into buildings? No, that wasn't. That all of a sudden that knowledge, that piece of knowledge, was kind of half forgotten. But it wasn't, I would say, a big problem. I would say it's a big problem. But the most important one is, and still, if I talk to people, it's still sort of a forgotten issue, is that when we make a transition from a hallway into a bedroom or whatever it might be, you're still in that case flowing a fog through an opening into a bedroom. You're pressurizing that bedroom, and if that bedroom doesn't have an opening, you're getting it back out in the hallway. And that piece of information, like the exact same, you're doing the exact same thing, but you're just geographically in a different position. You're not pushing it out through a window. You're pushing it in through a door or in through it. It's nowhere to be found. It's like nobody has ever talked about it or thought about it, I guess, in the Swedish Fire Service, and it's not being going on in the CFB community either. But what have you been taught? You've been taught, well, short pulses have died away, and everybody's pretty much teaching long pulses. And if the long pulse is not enough, well, you open the bale and flow as much as you need until the flames are gone. And what happens if you're in the hallway and having the same technique flowing into the bedroom? You're basically pressurizing that bedroom, and everything that's in the bedroom is going to come back at you. And if there's a really nasty fire, you might get chased out of that hallway. And it might be entirely because of you. But that small piece, I find it so interesting that you can have in your head a thought that I understand that I'm pushing smoke and gases, everything with hydraulic ventilation, but just put me in a different geographical position, and I will forget everything about it. That is interesting.
Explicitly, actually,
what?
With our guys, we put them in our training building, our smokehouse here, and put them in a hallway and teach them certain techniques for a high heat release rate fire with the vent open opposite them, and then we close it. And we do that a couple of times, and one works very well, as you know, when it's open. If we close it on them and they get absolutely soaked with all this blowback, right? And it seems to resonate with them. It helps them connect that piece of understanding the vent profile in combination with the heat release rate, the water requirements, and their technique. But yeah, we try to bring that home, and I think it can be done to some.
Absolutely. It's just I'm just so fascinated that I've gone through my entire career and it sounds like I'm working forever. I've gone through my career. It's been going to conferences and courses around the world, and it's been like again, nobody has made that connection on that level. Like connected those two pieces of information, and to be frank, it wasn't until again came to America and the trials started to come, because we've been doing offensive firefighting with PPA. I mean, the concept's always been there to push the streams ahead of us if we have an opposite vent point. The concepts of you can rotate your stream and everything. I mean, the concepts of moving the products of combustion, the steam, the heat in front of you has been there. It's just that, again, when you take it to a new position, you go like, now we don't have an opposite vent point. We're only going to do gas cooling. Poof, it's just, it wasn't there anymore. So there has been some, and I'm so fascinated about how bits and pieces are not connected. Like you can have the knowledge, and I'm throwing stones in glass houses. You can have all the knowledge, but if nobody actually points it out that these two are connected, you kind of go like, eh?
Yeah, sure.
And it's
right now that we don't know, and we're overestimating our state of knowledge right now. And in a couple of years, like, how did we not see that?
No, I don't. I'm trying to be humble in that and understanding that I'm not perfect, but it is interesting, and I think that plays in. But I think it plays into the part also that when we talk about gas cooling, again, the technique of doing the fog. There are so many bits and pieces that makes it a complicated technique to do it effective and efficient. There are many pitfalls. But I want to go through. I know that you've got a time constraint, but I want to go through the pitfalls of straight stream gas cooling also. I think that's important. Now, because first off, there is I hate, and I really now hate is a strong word. I strongly dislike that people who say, well, pushing for more flow, they are the first one who doesn't give the negatives of more flow. Like, you need bigger fire trucks, you need bigger hydrant systems, you need more tank water, you create more runoff, you need bigger hose lines, you need lower pressure if you want to get even more, you need solid stream if you want even more. And again, you have that, and all those are negatives. Because you take more manpower, takes more training to move the hose line, take more physical effort, and so on. So there are many big disadvantages, and those are, in my context, massive, because we're working in a system where we're moving towards more and more small vehicles, because it's more important to get there fast than to get there later and strong.
Sure.
Like, and so that doesn't fit the whole system as overall. Which I think we're going the right approach. I don't think the approach is to have bigger and fewer fire trucks. I think the approach is to have smaller and more diverse fire trucks with high pressure systems and so on. That can do more with less.
Sure.
But to have a big sledgehammer somewhere. So I think there's big disadvantages all there. But what I'm really find to be interesting is that we talked about the effect of cooling the linings. But what happens if there aren't any linings close by, or those linings doesn't perform as you think they perform? For instance, if you have a straight stream, and we talked about this, but we have a straight stream and it's false ceiling, and the stream goes up through the false ceiling, and that's where you cool the linings, and it flushes basically up in the false void space, start raining down on those plates in the ceiling. Like, I could picture myself a number of those scenarios where the surfaces you're trying to cool does not perform to your expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's going to be those. I mean, that's a great example of when that would probably be most likely. I don't know how many other cases would be quite like that.
No, it might be that the deflection doesn't go in the direction you want. Maybe it's a slope. Like say it's a slope ceiling. So you're flowing water here, expecting it to rain down or flow down here, but you're deflecting it that way, but the fire's coming from that direction. Like, there's multiple performance issues where a surface doesn't behave the way you think it would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, gas cooling for us is not the panacea. You know, it's like we're always constantly trying to get simultaneous line deployment. If we have exterior opportunity, a line's going there while the interior line's being set up with forcible entry, crews getting on air, everything set up, that line should be flowed and into that exterior opportunity to knock it down. We have smoke curtains on our truck. We're minimizing ventilation. We're trying to take care of the heat release rate multiple ways before our crews even get inside, or, you know, in that process of moving inside. So it's not the panacea for us. It's something we do whenever possible to increase the safety as we move to progress towards that fire. And is it going to work in every situation? No. And that's why we don't rely on just one thing, right? We have those other pieces that we're trying to implement at the same time whenever possible. And there's drawbacks of it for sure. And you hit most of those, you know, increased line size, increased physical demand to move that line. I mean, 1 3/4, proper 1 3/4 true ID, like interior diameter hose isn't that big, or that bad. It's not like 2.5. 2.5 is a whole other story. But 1 3/4 is pretty mellow. You get two guys can.
Oh yeah, two 1 3/4
with properly trained, with knowledgeable.
Unless it's like low pressure, because you have all those kink points.
Yeah, and that's another consideration. So for us, that was a consideration. We ended up going with 75 PSI fog nozzles, but we also were in the market for all new hose, and we tested all sorts of hose, and we ended up coming up with this. There's new technology with different weaves, and the old stuff used to pinch. Our old hose used to kink at about 22 to 24 inch diameter. Yeah. The new stuff's coming down to like 11 inches. Yeah. So less than 30 centimeters, 25 or 26 or so. So it's getting
a small radius.
So the kinking potential and likelihood of it is reduced. Yeah. We did go to 50 PSI nozzles, which we could have. We dropped it to 75 rather than 100. So we tried to match those challenges and those concerns, and the best we could, and balance those. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, and I think that too. I mean, and I agree with everything you said, like everything, it's just it's hard to, yeah. Hey, it's not fun talking to you because we agree on too much.
We disagree.
What?
When the cameras are off and we're less diplomatic.
Well, we're more frustrated, but we're maybe not much disagreeable. We're more frustrated on the events of the world. But
This one.
no, yeah. So you still have to teach when it's not enough. So you say, well, it's not a panacea, and absolutely not. And I say again, I think I want to downplay it also the role it has in overall firefighting. But when your firefighters move in, would you say, do you teach your firefighters like if you move in and you're starting flowing that line, and it doesn't, it doesn't change the environment, you still have rolling flames coming at you. Of course, you're saying, well, it doesn't work, back out. But do you teach them to switch to fog to cool ahead of them, or do you teach that they continue working that straight stream moving out?
Yeah, they're staying on straight stream and they're whipping it in whatever direction they need, horseshoe circles, and just staying with that and just working. I mean, as you break up 150 GPM on a straight stream and you whip it around, the effect. It's still a lot.
Oh, it's okay.
So picture the human factor of that. They're coming around a corner, they're not winning, they're getting beat up, and then they got to, in the limited visibility, now they got to find the right fog angle. I mean, it's possible, but I just want to keep things simple as long as it's effective and safe. And they're going to keep it on a straight stream. They're going to flow, keep the bail open, communicate with their crew, back out, flow, and cool the entire space that they can on their way out.
No, I don't have a big issue with that. I would say that it's in that sense of protecting yourself, in the sense that, let's say we have a surface that doesn't perform as we want it to. So sure, you can whip it around, and it's faster. The more you whip it around, the more droplets you kind of create in that void ahead of you. And if you really work it, it's much more droplets, especially from a fog nozzle. This solid. I really do not like solid stream nozzles because they're worse doing that also. But when you whip a straight stream around, there's a plenty amount of droplets being formed in front of you. So there is a big cooling factor, even though you're not having a surface and breaking such droplets off or cooling the linings to any big extent. I think you can be very successful as long as you recognize that you have to whip it around as fast as you can. But that being said, you would be more effective in that case when you don't have surfaces that performs to go to a fog. Now, is that important enough to do training on? No, that might be something that you skip because of some simplicity. I don't have a big problem with that. It's just a good thought exercise, if nothing else. And I think that you should talk about it with firefighters, going like, what are you actually trying to pour? If you're being pushed out of a building with 150 GPM flowing, and you're whipping it around, your surfaces are not performing. Like, I think that they should recognize that. But if you're flowing so much water in a fairly limited space and you're not being effective, there's something wrong.
Yeah, there's probably a few other errors that have occurred as well.
Oh yeah. There's ventilation going on. There's maybe a wind-driven fire. There's no door control behind your back and so on. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that problem.
Yeah.
For sure.
But no, a really important consideration. You're absolutely right. That it's totally important.
Cool. We haven't talked about ventilation, but you need to go. Because ventilation would be other nice topic to talk about.
Another 5 or 10 if you want.
So the quick shot, like when we came back from Sydney about ventilation, I mean, obviously anti-ventilation as a concept was not well established in North Vancouver or in Canada overall.
We were fans, man. Yeah. It was hose and fan to the front door.
Yeah.
And we had varying degrees of success. I mean, we saw some go well, we saw some go not well, and some close calls with that tool. And we understand it more now that we have some some more important information out of you all. It answered some questions and helped us understand that a little more. So for us, we've gone away from it. The last as we started educating our guys over the last decade, they started seeing the bit of the conflict between, you know, energy consumption or oxygen consumption and energy, and then the fan moves a lot of oxygen
and that air and mixing,
and you know, that all sorts of things. So it almost naturally happened where guys had seen enough go bad with the fan, and then they had some other techniques that I'd say replaced the fan. They had a new level of knowledge and understanding. They were able to make better decisions, and then we started controlling the air a lot, and all of a sudden our fires started going really, really well. Yeah, does everyone go great? No, but our record, our ratio, our game record is definitely improved dramatically, and you know, and that's largely because we've shifted our ventilation practices. It's not that we don't ventilate, and it's not that we don't use a fan. In fact, I was a big proponent of a capital budget request last year that put new fans on every apparatus because some of ours were old and they weren't very effective, and we needed good fans. But we still use them, but the sequence in which they're applied has changed. So before it was fan before water, now it's water before fan.
So how would you define water fan post water? What's the criteria for convincing ventilation? Any form of ventilation?
Sure. I mean, our objective is to bring the often vent-controlled fire, ventilation-limited fire back to a fuel-limited state.
But how do you define that? Like, how do you practically identify that on fire ground?
Sure. So we give our guys, whether it's from the exterior, you know, we've educated them about fire dynamics and also given some bullet point cues. You know, diminished flame, volume, velocity, changing color, indicating steam conversion. Am I seeing these things? Does my 360 show me that there's no other openings? Is this the suspected isolated compartment? And those things. And then it's not just, okay, we'll turn on the fan. So it's not just, you know, there's a constant process of reevaluation and observation and checking if they're getting their desired outcomes once they apply that fan that we've tried to instill in them. And and it's both exterior observations, interior observations. If they're interior and they've made it to the suspected fire area, we've suggested that they begin with hydraulic ventilation to clear out enough gases and improve visibility enough to determine that they do in fact have the area of origin and the area of involvement, and it's not just, you know, they're in one of the areas before they turn on the fans. So we want them to have good eyes on the area in need of fire control. Once they've established that, they can either back out to turn on the fan, or if they really believe they have control, they can communicate with the crew outside to initiate the fan. But they're always there monitoring the radio, can shut it down in a moment's notice. We've tried to define the sequence and the requirements for the use of the fan much more closely than we did in the past. That's for sure.
I think that's I think the observation of going, like, people who really like the fan before water application haven't had their really bad fire yet. It's not like you can use the fan a lot of times and it works well. The problem is knowing when it's not going to go well. And you know, that amplified on the UL studies and also showing like how do we know the interior design, the layout of the structure? No. Do we know the room of origin? Is that the only room? No, we don't know. Do we know the size of the door inside to the fire compartment? No, and so on. There's so many unknown variables that's going to impact if that's going to go well. But for me, the second one is that even if you decide post knockdown, it's the question of identifying when is it appropriate to put it on and getting it simple enough. And the whole concept of reading fire is also riddled with hazards and problems, and very hard to educate firefighters to become even a little bit proficient in reading fires reliably. So I'm pretty much down to temperature, and I've stick with temperature right now because it's a tangible thing, meaning that if I would have very limited amount of time, meaning I want to create a robot, my direction for putting the fan on would be no flame and combustion in the fire compartment, meaning maybe we don't see an invisible flame, and we have smoke temperatures below 150 degrees Celsius. And you can check smoke temperatures roughly with a tick, or place your hand up. And if you're not screaming when you put your hand up, it's cold enough, like without a glove. Meaning that would be suspenders and belt, like the most safe one. If you don't have any flame combustion and smoke temperatures are relatively cool. But then if I would apply that to every fire, it would be a fairly inefficient fire, because that takes some time to establish those two benchmarks. So from that, it becomes more interesting in saying that, well, can we apply the fan on and start ventilation process? Well, whatever ventilation, if it's with a fan or open the window or hydraulic, can we do that earlier? Well, yeah, you can do that even if you have some flaming combustion here and so on, if it's incipient. But how do you judge if it's incipient? And I go back to temperature. Like if the temperature of the smoke inside that fire compartment, or let's say it's a small apartment outside in the hallway, if you have below 150 degrees Celsius in the smoke, I would commence ventilation. Because you for two reasons. One, it's probably not a serious fire, or you knocked it back to it's not a serious fire anymore because it's heavily temperature dependent. And second of all, which is most, because I don't care, some call it, well, do you know if the smoke is flammable or not? That's the thing, if you put a fan on, it's flammable, it could be cold smoke and it's going to mix everything around and it goes woof. But what I draw it on is that, like, practically you don't have any option to put the fan on. If you move inside a propane-filled house with cold propane, the only way you have of mitigating that risk is to ventilate that structure. You can't do anything with your hose line. It doesn't matter how much water you put in there. And if you have cold smoke, even if it's combustible, you don't have any option but to ventilate it. So I have a benchmark. That's 150 degrees Celsius. That's my benchmark. If you go below that in central key area of a small apartment, you can start ventilation. Or if you have 150 inside the fire compartment, the smoke, you can start to ventilate. That's like the most tangible way of deciding when I can and cannot ventilate.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you need to design a nozzle that has a thermocouple at the end. Guys can just point up to the ceiling.
Yeah, but it is.
Display is 4 or 5 feet down on the hose, and they can.
But it is. I mean, the gimmicks and so on. But there is. I mean, you can do, because of course it leads to the problem of measuring smoke temperature with a tick and so on. But if you're in the hallway, if you go, I would say if you're in a hallway, if you're going inside this, let's say you go inside a house or an apartment that says single residential, it's not 2 stories, you're moving inside the hallway, and you feel like this doesn't seem like, there's not flames shooting at you, and you do with your tick up in there, and you read, below 150 degrees. Now, could it be warmer up there? Absolutely. If the gas temperatures could be warmer, they probably are warmer. But if you recognize that you don't see any temperatures above 150, and you expose the backside of your glove and you put it up, and you make a second check, and you're not going, "Jeez, that was hot." If you're doing those two things, you can be fairly sure that hallway is fairly cold. And if you have a hallway that cold inside a smaller house or an apartment, you don't have a substantial amount of fire. You can break a window, start ventilation. But if you have a higher temperature out in the hallway, you see that with your tick, you don't have to measure with your hand, because it's at least 150 degrees. Now you go down and knock the fire down, and then you commence ventilation afterwards.
I think the use of the tick in that environment is a little more complicated, but
it is and it isn't.
The gas temperature with the tick is pretty.
It's pretty damn useless. No. But it's. Would you say that you can get temperatures of 150 degrees, but the smoke is just 25? No. You would get an indication of 150 in the tick, but it's probably 300 in the smoke.
Yeah. I'm not sure what numbers I'd want to.
No, but it is in that direction.
Sure.
And I'm saying, I would say the tick. I would argue the tick is a good indicator of when is it appropriate, and then you do a rain check with your hand. You go like, if it's Jesus fucking height is hot in there, you attack the fire. Otherwise, you can ventilate.
Yeah, and that the whole glove check thing. I mean, that's a thing that's done in Sweden, but I don't know anywhere that teaches that in North America. I'm not saying it's wrong or bad. I mean, I'm probably comfortable enough to do it myself, but it's not something that's taught here. So
yeah, but it's just just a rain check to go like, because it's very tactile, and it goes like, you don't have to know that it's 150 or 300 or 600. You just have to know, is it cold, meaning under 150. If it's fairly cold, you don't have any option to deal with it besides ventilation anyway.
Sure.
And a single room on fire, even if that grows a little bit, that's a cakewalk with a nozzle.
Mm-hmm.
What's not a cakewalk if the entire space you're in goes into a big blender with a fan and everything goes woof around you.
For sure, and that's why we're not firing up the fan while guys are inside without them having hydraulically ventilated quite a clear path between the inlet and the outlet anyways. Right, and they've got eyes on, and only at that time is the officer confirm control of the space. Then they start using the fan to ventilate the rest of the structure to facilitate, second search, getting it all clear, and continuing with overhaul and searching for extension. And the fan doesn't stay on; it clears the space that she gets shut down. Because an issue we've seen is if you keep it on, you do have some void space extension, and you have the fan on. One of the good observations to help you find those void spaces is often smoke pushing out of cracks and voids. But if the fan's on, you're less likely to see that. And it's also, depending on the ventilation in those voids and the leakage profile, it may make the extension a lot worse.
Yeah.
So we try to use the fan initially as a temporary tool to help us get our secondary search and get eyes on the rest of the structure when it's safe to do so. So we take a pretty modest approach to using it compared to the past. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I got a problem. Like if I were to teach and I have limited time and I want to be safe, I would teach again no flame and combustion, 150 degrees in smoke, which would be equivalent to what you say. You knock the fire down. You basically created a fairly safe environment, but I would say it's a too defensive position. I would say that if you go into a small fire in a partial of a kitchen and so on, I think that the fan should be running way faster than you have those two criteria met. Because you're not wasting. You're losing so much time. So I'm not against it. I'm saying that I would be. I'm not going to use the word aggressive because I don't like the word itself, but I will be more. I would start using the ventilation earlier. I would start using the fan earlier if possible. I mean, a lot of times it's not possible because you need an outlet, and to create that outlet, you need to actually physically go there, and that's usually in the fire compartment. So it usually it usually is that you've knocked the fire compartment down, and then you create an outlet, and then the fan comes on, and then support that with hydraulic ventilation, which I think is a given.
Mm-hmm.
So in practice, you use that. But again, when we arrive to a fire where you have a possibility to make an outlet from the outside, you arrive, the inside crew reports cold conditions in the hallway. The officer looks on the outside and see, well, cold conditions on the inside in the hallway, looking good from the outside. Break a window, assist with the fan, and as soon as when they're on the way to the fire, and usually they're probably in the fire compartment, even though before the fan is on anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But the process is committed. The process is started before you actually have those criteria being met inside the fire compartment.
Gotcha.
Would you disagree?
No, it's
damn it!
Yeah.
Why can't you disagree?
seems reasonable to me.
Okay. Anything else you want to give a last minute remark?
There's nothing I can really think of.
What's your next change happening in terms of firefighting? What's the new thing to implement or to develop or expand on? Or
right now we're about to roll out another few weeks, another level, if you will, or another curriculum for crews, fire behavior training. And we're really focused on fine tuning our proficiency from the door to the seat of the fire. So we've been working on that for the last few years, but we keep building on some of the concepts and making the system a little more complete, making sure that everybody knows the system. And it's a system of operating line movement and communication and coordination within your interior crew and sizing up and extinguishment and ventilation and the whole.
Are you a blue card? Are you a blue card?
We are just transitioning. Yeah.
Okay, so that's part of that process too of having the right process.
Sure. That's not blue card's not under my portfolio, but it's the command system we operate under. But once that
it dictates a lot of the communication and so on.
Sure, the language part, but we're talking as well as what is the vernacular used between the officer to describe conditions to his crews. What does he want for desired distance and direction from his nozzleman? All sorts of stuff. So this year specifically, we're going to revisit some theory, and we're actually doing some adjustment with the way we use our fan and fine tuning some of the practices there. But we're just going to roll out more live fire as well and really try to fine tune the system. It's a good system that we found that was needed and to be effective inside safe. And then it can be deviated from when conditions dictate or there's challenges, complexities. It's not a rigid system, but it's a framework in which to start from, and it gives our guys something to work off when everybody's on the same page. It was something that was missed. So my specific FPT portfolio has expanded a little bit over the last few years from very focused on knowledge and understanding the tactical implementation or implications of our techniques and stuff like that to identifying that we need, in order to extinguish properly and do certain things, and we need to get better at other things like line movement and crew cohesion interior and using our thermometers properly and all that stuff. So that's kind of fallen under our portfolio as well because we're the ones that do live fire training. So
you're focusing more on actually their behavior rather than the reasons for their behavior. Meaning there's more proportionally you're doing more how than why you did before.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of why for a long time.
Yeah,
and they get it. They're in. But we need to work on some muscle mechanics a little more. And it's the weaker part of our system right now. So that's largely what this next year will be for us doing live fire.
Do you think that well, for instance, line movement, do you think that piece become much more important when you switch to doing flowing continuously with 150 GPM, or was that a missing piece before also?
Flow continuously with 150 GPM.
What?
What's that? We don't just flow and go from the front door to the
fire.
Oh,
I thought that you said so because I was going like, well, okay, but you go flow and go. You go flow and then you move.
We flow as needed.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah.
And we teach our guys to observe conditions, identify the requirements, and based on all sorts of things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You don't have to. I was not going to confront you on that one. We were talking about other things. I don't have a real problem. Again, going to single family house, I don't have a real problem about just flowing all the way in. If the house is being torn down anyway, and you have the water. But again, that context for having all that water, you would have to connect to a hydrant if you're going to do a long push and so on. There's so many problems. So I'm much more in favor in that one. Now, you could argue from the UL studies that the grow back between, for instance, flow and go versus flowing all the time is bigger, but that's not strange because you're flowing continuously. But again, that doesn't justify you not having that you can't shut down and move.
Yeah, the hit and move versus the flow and go, so to speak. Yeah, like our guys are taught everything in between, and we
Yeah.
try to teach them why and when one would be appropriate, when the other would not. And I want our guys to have I mean, we've got high rises here, of course. We're right on the water. We get big winds. We have the potential for quite strong wind-driven events. Our buildings get built with a lot of windows. The potential for high heat release rate fires here is huge. And we have them. I want our guys to have the skill set to manage those and understand. And so on their worst day, at their worst fire, do they have the skill sets and the knowledge to manage that? And I want that to be yes. And from there, we try to dial it all the way back to a pot on the stove, right? So to speak.
Yeah.
Like from the worst case scenario to the absolute bread and butter, you're mopped up and home in 90 minutes kind of thing. What does that look like, right? Why are you choosing one technique versus the other, one flow technique and hose technique versus the other? So it's not a one size fits all for us. We're not dumbing this down to that level. I don't like that term, but we're not simplifying.
It's simplifying. I mean, it's used as simplifying.
Yeah.
A derogatory term, but that's what we do all the time. We try to simplify it to the lowest level we can without making it stupid.
Yeah.
And when that's our job as educators, we have to simplify to give time for other more priority things to train on.
Sure.
So it's just finding the right level.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how we got onto that discussion there, but
no, we got it from you talked. I asked a question about the concept. The skill of moving hose line, did that increase the need for that when you changed to straight stream gas cooling, or was it always a problem area?
It's always an area that needed work, and it just became more obvious when we started doing more and more live fire training.
So you can stop in anytime you need to go, but when you talk about thermal imaging, but when we see and what we recognize when we start working more with thermal imager, the different departments go in different directions. Now, do the nozzle person have the tick, or does the backup person have the tick? That's a big thing. Or do both have ticks? And it changed also because if you go to Stockholm, their backup firefighter has basically a dog leash connected to the hose line. So that backup, who is usually the backup, they're the searching with the tick, and the nozzle operator is moving the hose line, and the tick person assist with the hose line when needed, and so on. There's multiple ways of going how you work with the tick, but what it did change, and what we haven't landed on is, because the thermal imager changed so much in terms of how fast you can search, how fast you can orientate yourself, how good you can be at placing your hose line if you're assisted with a tick compared to just moving and trying to flow in zero visibility, assessing your outcome with your nozzle, and so on. So all those things had to be changed, and it basically, the old way of searching a space didn't become redundant. It might be initiated later, but it had to change everything. And we haven't landed in what's the optimal approach yet, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's probably likely because it's the same way we felt as every position on the line. If you have one TI, who holds that TI? It's pros and cons to every position, and you can argue it all day long.
Yeah.
For us, settled on it's the person behind the nozzle.
So it's the second, the backup fire was the second one. And what would you say were the primary reasons for putting it there compared to on the nozzle person?
Because it's usually the officer. And the techniques that we've trained our guys to scan the room, high, middle, low, assess, getting it all in. We've taught them, they're able to get their right arm over that right shoulder. They've got good audio, mouth to ear, and then get that right in front of the firefighter's mask and share the view. Give him direction, distance, desire. Hey, yeah, it looks good. We're controlling the space. Let's advance down the hall to that doorway. We'll stop there, right? And you share that view. shows him what's important in that environment and where he's going, puts it down, and they move together, kind of thing.
So let's say this is an interesting area. So if you were to decide we're going to go for fire attack, you get to a hallway, you get to a doorway, you're making that scan, second person scans together with the first firefighter, and you see we're going to go to that direction, that's where fire is. Would you then put your tech down and search left or right side wall, or would you go straight to that position, the low stand? So would you always follow a wall?
No, I think it's totally dependent, and a fair question we get. I think it's environmentally dependent, right? What space you're in, what kind of obstructions you have, how likely you are to be able to stay oriented to your space and physically oriented, because we try to teach our guys, the TI is a great tool, but it's a digital tool. It runs on a battery, and it's susceptible to failure. We can't forget the basics and stay physically connected and oriented to that structure. That if it goes down and if we're in trouble, do we know where we are? Can we get out? And so forth. So whether they always stay on the wall is past practice, which is a good practice, is dependent. How far is that stretch between leaving the wall and regaining it? Are you cutting out a little alcove where you're really going into no man's land in a warehouse with little reference to direction and distance? So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. We give our guys the options.
You give them the option to choose.
Sure, highlighted with the pros and the risks and value of each option, and they decide.
So would you?
But I should wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we could talk about that one. That's an interesting one. Okay, so no, we just wrap up now. Always good chatting, Ian. I think we have to have another chat at some point.
Anytime.
Because I would love to share my thoughts on something that may be more of a discussion rather than a overview of what you're doing. Because most of the things I knew, I have more things I want to ponder upon, or maybe on the next call.
Sure, sounds good. Anytime.
Cool.
So okay, well, thanks for your time, and hello to anybody that's out there, and you're a big enough fire geek just like Lars and I to sit here and listen and watch. So good on you. You guys are going to be the ones that are also, I'm sure, changing your fire service and making the place a lot better. So good efforts on you. Hopefully. And yeah, I'm sure. All right. Well, thanks, Lars.
Talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.